Vygotsky, like Piaget, he emphasized that children actively construct their knowledge and understanding. So they're an active participant in trying to figure out this world. Vygotsky, though, the big difference between him and Piaget is he emphasized the role of the social environment in stimulating cognitive development. He believed that society and the people in it and the environment provide the tools to support cognitive development, and that cognitive development is going to be shaped by the culture in which we live in. With my in-person classes, again, we have a lot of discussions. I also have a lot of group projects. I have them do their quizzes in groups because I really believe in some of these ideas from Vygotsky and the idea that a really strong way to learn is to learn from your peers, to learn from your environment, instead of just learning from somebody that's just, a professor that's just blah, 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 blah. If you actually are discussing things with your peers, I think that you understand them better. And it's not just the person that asks a question. Like if one of the students, if you're doing a quiz together with other students and one of the students says, I don't understand this question or these responses, and the other student explains it, it turns out both students actually learn the material better because the one student's asking the question and they are learning from the student that's talking about it. But a real measure of how much you actually know something is, can you explain it to another person? And so they're both learning when you have people working in groups like that. I know sometimes group work is problematic, but there is definitely a strong benefit to that over that rote memorization type learning. Anyways, with Vygotsky, he talks about the zone of proximal development, ZPD. It's a range of tasks that's too difficult for the child to master alone, but that can be learned from guidance from either an adult or another peer that has similar skills. The lower level of the skill reached by the child working independently alone. So if you give them a task and the child's able to do it pretty easily on their own, that's the lower limit. The upper limit, they can't quite do it by themselves. And so they need a little bit of assistance from the instructor. A teacher, what they want to do is they want to start at that upper limit and they want to move down until they get to where the child is at, and so that they can bring the child up. You don't want to start too low and you don't want to start too high and not come down to meet them at their level. As an example, tying shoes. You don't want to do the entire thing for them for the rest of their lives, obviously, so you want to give them just enough assistance to do it on their own. If they get stuck somewhere, you facilitate them and guide them and try to get through that part. And all of this makes sense intuitively. So if you start too easy and they can already do it, you're wasting your time and their time. You're boring them. If you start too hard, they won't be able to do it. You're possibly going to create some shame and some doubt. What you're trying to do when you're getting them through these tasks is get them to feel independent and successful. You want them to be, winners on these tasks. If you start too low, they'll be bored. You start too high, they're going to feel like they can't do it at all. So you got to get right in that sweet spot. Sometimes they'll surprise you though. As an example, so I feed the dogs. There's a lot of steps into that. So I have to go to the food container. I have to open up the food container. I have to get the bowl. I have to get the scoop, put it in the bowl, put the bowl down for the dog. I was always doing this around dinner time when Leif would be sitting at the table. And one day he just gets up on his own and he opens it up and he gets out the bowl and he does all of that on his own. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lengthy process. There's a lot of steps to that, but he was able to do all those steps on his own because he had been watching me. And so this is the idea of modeling. And so we've talked about this in this chapter. We'll also talk about it in some later chapters. This is also one way of kind of getting into this zone, the idea of you showing them how to do it, maybe not verbally, maybe not walking them all the way through it, but if they just see you going through the actions, they're going to be able to pick some of that up, and even maybe to a shocking extent. Again, that was one of those. So one day he knows how to feed the dogs. Anyways, an important concept for Vygotsky is called scaffolding. And so this is changing the level of support over the course of a teaching session. So again, that's moving it from that upper limit if you need to move it down to get to where they're at. Or if you're too low, you need to move it up. And so that's going to be called scaffolding. And a teacher that's good at this, the most skilled teachers, are the people that can make those adjustments. When they're first learning a task, if it is going to be a hard task, when they're first learning it, direct instruction may be an appropriate way to go, or maybe like the modeling like I was talking about. And then as they get better, then you give less and less guidance, and you give them a little bit of time to try to figure it out on their own. You don't want to get them to the point where they're frustrated, but you do want them to at least to try to think through it a little bit on their own. Just kind of as another side note, the other day in another class, not in this one, a student sent me a message. They posted on the discussion boards. They asked, how do I cite in APA, how do I cite the lecture slides? And it is a good, legitimate question. And I started to look up the answer because, I don't ever cite lecture slides. So that's something I'm going to have to go look up myself too. And as I'm looking it up, I'm like, why am I looking this up? What I should do as an instructor, I could just say, here is the answer. And so that would be that direct instruction approach. But it's not a good learning modality. And so what I did instead was I said, hey, that's a great question. I'm kind of curious myself. What I would do to find the answer to that is I'd go to the Purdue OWLS Writing Lab website, and I would look up how they cite lecture slides. Maybe you could go do that and come check back with us. I know it seems like I'm putting the work on them, which I am, because they're the ones that need to learn how to do it. I don't need to learn how to cite lecture slides. It's not something I'm going to need right now, but it is something that they probably need. And so again, what I'm doing there is I'm facilitating, I'm guiding, I'm not giving direct instruction. I'm not just giving the answer. And so that's the exact type of thing we're talking about here with Vygotsky's, the scaffolding and trying to get into those limits. So through a dialogue, you're trying to get the child to be more systematic, logical, and rational. And so with the scaffolding, what you're doing is providing hints, a little bit of instruction, a little bit of insistence, and again, changing the level of support. If that student had come back and said, I don't know what Purdue OWL's website is, what is that? Then I could explain that. So I'm lowering the limit to try to get to where they're at. If some people, though, they're like, I'm just going to give them the answer so they can move on, blah, blah, blah. You think you're being nice by doing that, but that has probably been the learning type of modality they've had their entire lives, where the people just give them the answer and they don't have. Anyways, you might think that you're being nice by just giving them the answer. You're not. You're doing the opposite. You're actually taking an opportunity away from them to be able to figure out things on their own and to use their own critical thinking skills. And so you actually want to help them and facilitate those skills more than you do just having some random answer to some question. Teach them how to go find the answers on their own. And also with Vygotsky, he was big on he's big on language, and he's big on language and thought, and he called it private speech. So according to Vygotsky, children use speech both for social communication, communicating with other people, and they use it to help them to solve tasks. So private speech, according to Vygotsky, is used for self-regulation, to plan, to guide, and to monitor their behavior. As children age, they begin to act without verbalizing, and then the self-talk becomes internalized and becomes inner speech. Some research shows that children that use private speech are more socially competent than those that don't. It's almost like you have to learn how to communicate with yourself first, and if you become good at practicing communicating to yourself, you become good at communicating with other people. And essentially, this talking to yourself, you're doing this for self-regulation, to keep yourself on task. Some of you might do this. I still do this actually a little bit myself. So what kids will do is they will say things out loud to keep them on task. For example, they might say, don't touch that. Don't eat the cookies. A really good example from another textbook was, it was a kid that was talking to himself. You could hear him on the baby monitor. It was during the night and he was trying to go to sleep. And he said to himself, Alex, go to sleep. Alex, go to sleep. So he is using this private speech to talk to himself to try to self-regulate himself. Maybe a kid that's putting a puzzle together and they talk to themselves and they talk through it. That's private speech. And yes, kids eventually will internalize it and becomes their thoughts. They're not saying everything out loud. But yes, more private speech, more social competence. So if kids talking to themselves, let them do it. And yes, Vygotsky did believe that this was a key to being a good social communicator, by beginning to communicate with yourself. All right. On the next set of slides, we'll get into Vygotsky's teaching strategies.